Hello, I'm Lewis Kaufman, and I'm going to give a talk about Conway Life and a generalization of Conway Life that I call Life7. Let's begin by talking about Conway Life. Conway Life is a cellular automaton in 2 dimensions where one uses a square lattice, and every point in the lattice has 8 neighbors, like that. And you are born if you become a white square on the lattice. Otherwise, a black square is a dead square. And you are born if you have 3 neighbors exactly that are white. You survive if you have 2 or 3 neighbors. And let's look at some of the properties of Conway Life. So, for example, if I have these 3 neighbors and this point, then that will be born. And we can look again and see what happens at the next generation, but nothing is happening because, as you see, how many neighbors does this point have? It has 2 neighbors, doesn't have 3. Nobody has 3. But if we put in one more point, then this point will have 3 neighbors and a birth occurs. And then some deaths occur. And then another death occurs, and then the whole thing goes away. We can consider many configurations and watch what happens, or we can put in a relatively random configuration and watch what happens from generation to generation. All the updating is done simultaneously in Conway Life, and it goes along for a while. And as you see, sometimes things go into a little oscillation. Sometimes things move around. Let's take a look at what's happening here. And here you have the phenomenon called a glider. This configuration of 5 points, let's magnify it and take a look. This configuration of 5 points gives rise to another configuration, which gives rise to another configuration, which gives rise to another. And as you see, it walks along, cycling through its own pattern and reproduces itself a few steps down the line. If you want to, you can analyze every single step, but it's still kind of mysterious that this guy does what it does, but it is, in fact, quite normal if you take a random configuration and get life started on it. The gliders will appear. And the other thing that's quite normal is that the configuration, as you run it, will fall down after a while into oscillating or static isolated entities. It may take a little while. Let's watch this one. Except, of course, for the gliders, which may continue on into the outer board. There's one going off into the outer board. And since this board is quite large, those gliders will keep on going and going and going. And if the board were given boundary conditions that were toral, that you could go back to the other side or from bottom to top, then the gliders might go forever, unless they bumped into something that was previously there. So this is quite characteristic of Conway Life, and there are remarkable configurations that can happen here. Let's take a look at one. This is the famous glider gun. discovered by Gosper and his group in the 1970s. And the glider gun is a mechanism which produces gliders. Let's illustrate by eliminating all these gliders for a while that have occurred from this glider gun. Go back up to the glider gun and run it slowly so we see it in its process. Assembling our glider in between these two moving parts, and the glider walks down away from the mechanism, and this repeats, and the glider gun puts out gliders one after another, one after another. You might wonder whether a glider gun could occur spontaneously on the life board, and that's another matter. I don't think anyone has yet seen a glider gun occur spontaneously, but it was engineered, and you can even investigate just how it came about by taking a look at the mechanism of it a little bit. Let me get it into position here. You see that there are these two important pieces in the glider gun. Let's erase some things that are less important, like this glider that just got produced, and a few of these gliders. Okay, and now let's get a copy of this guy. And let's watch how he behaves all by himself. And you see that he has returned to a copy of himself, but has emitted a little 6 rectangle there. And this has happened upstairs as well. But now, before we see how that little rectangle behaves, let's take a copy of the other piece and put that out here where we could look at it and see how that behaves over time. And you see, it produces a copy of the guy that was on the left and a little piece. But the guy that was, but it's reversed in its direction. So these two entities that are going inside the glider gun are time-shifted versions of the same thing, and what they produce between them just manages to collide with itself, produce a glider, and these end pieces here end up absorbing some of the other stuff that gets produced, and so all that happens is that gliders happen from time to time as the machine continues its operation. So the Gosper group was lucky enough and clever enough to notice the spontaneous appearances of these pieces of the glider gun. Notice that when time shifted with respect to one another and colliding or producing things that collided with one another, gliders were produced and managed to create the glider gun. A triumph of engineering on the basis of some of the patterns that are available in the Life board. So, what I want to talk about is a variant of Life, and I'm going to set it up now and tell you the rule, and we'll see how that behaves. Now, my variant that I'm interested in changes the rule like that, and I call this Life7. We are born if we have 3 or if you have 7 neighbors and you survive on 2 and 3. And for the sake of an experiment, we could take the configuration that we just made and run it and see how it will behave in Life 7. Well, the glider gun fell apart, as you see. Here's a row of gliders heading on off. The other part seems to be pretty active. Let's run it faster and see just how active the other part is. Quite active. This sometimes will fall to just static configurations and oscillators, but very often it behaves just like this experiment and continues to remain active throughout, perhaps forever, although it would be hard to prove that it has the forever property. But there it is, working away. And if you step back some distance from it, you see that you have a little universe which is sending gliders out in 4 directions. And this universe is behaving quite actively and working away on itself like that. And as it happens, some things will occur spontaneously that are quite interesting, as well as this active volcanic kind of oscillating mass. And I want to show you that by going to a demonstration of it. Let me see if I can find what I'm looking for. Other initial configuration. Here's my emergent phenomenon. Let's slow this down so you can see it and magnify that a little bit. See those? Nice little header. And that little pair of guys is just going to move on forward, leaving a trail of all sorts of complex things behind it. Let's look at it from a distance now. Run the thing back at full speed. Well, that's perhaps too fast. Let's slow it down a little bit. There. So this often happens. You run it for many, many thousands of generations, in this case, almost 20,000 generations, and then all of a sudden, one of these emergent forms will occur and start growing away like this. And let's take a close look at that emergent form. That should be good. Now, you might take a look at this. You see these little triangular form, or it's a little box here with 5 and then 2 more, one peaked in the middle and one asymmetrically placed on the outside and on the outside. And they're mirror imaged here with respect to one another. And if we were to if we were to erase the stuff directly behind them, or we could watch just what they're producing as we let it run. Always symmetrical. And you see that's where it started, but now it's mirror imaged in the other way with these two next to one another and some things behind. And then next to one another. Opposite. And alternating in that way. And there's material being generated from behind. So it may be worthwhile watching it. Remember, some of this is from before. Here's what I was looking for. Do you see what's happened here? Right here. That's 1/2 of our mirror pattern. And you will see it coming together again. There it is, the little box with the top and the dot to the right, and the box with the top and the dot. And it looks like it's propagating vertically. And you might wonder, well, it doesn't seem to quite survive. It doesn't quite survive. You don't see things heading on off vertically for very long. They die out. They're happening here and dying out. So this leads to an experiment. The experiment is to take a piece of the head of this. Let's magnify it. Take a piece of the head of it, 1/2 of the mirrored head. All right, and let's get ourselves some room here and put it in place and watch it evolve all by itself. There it is, flipped, and some stuff behind it. And there it is again with some stuff behind it. And again. This time it didn't survive. The material behind it interacted with it, and it has now died out, and it's not propagating forward any longer. And some other material has come into play. In fact, as you see, it just died out. So one of them alone dies out, but mirrored together in the right way survives. And here's a most curious experiment. There it is. here's our little box with the top and the point to the right, and I've mirrored them in a different way, wondering what would happen to them if I mirrored them in a different way. And I'm just going to quickly run this and let you see what happens. They interact and produce a mirrored pair going in the opposite direction. And you can let that run faster and see what it grows into if you want. I want to show you, well, actually, let's take a look at this, running it for a little while. So you see from practically nothing, we begin to get one of those universes that is producing lots of gliders, and it's also producing this strong extending part, growing nicely. And now I want to do an experiment, but I think I will go back to a more or less clean board. Let's, in fact, go back to this one and generate for a little while. Let's let it build up. That's pretty good, I think. So here it is in its active state. And now let's change the rule and put it back to life. But of course, actually, it will put it back to anti-life if I run it, because using only the Conway Life rule, all that extra activity goes away, and we have this configuration quite quiescent. And I could reset my rule to Life7 and put it into run condition again, and nothing happens. However, let's see what will happen if I were to just inject a little random seed in here like that. Now you see what happened. It spreads like wildfire and reconstitutes the highly interactive living form that we had before. If you step away, you see that there was an interruption in that world, in that the glider pattern is broken. That's what happened. We broke the glider pattern, the glider emission pattern, which is now starting again. But down here, it's back to life, or it's back to the spread of whatever had started there. So let's do it one more time. I will put out the life. It goes into a quiescent state. we'll reset the Life7 rules. We'll add a little infection right there. And oops, that wasn't enough. Maybe a little more. Yeah. All right. And now it spreads. And you can think of this as an overly simplified model of how a virus or a disease could spread throughout a large population. I think it has a lot of the characteristics of that. And so it gives you a sense of how quickly an interaction can spread through neighboring interactions in a space, in an automaton space in this case. So this is Life7. Life7 is very similar to Conway Life, except that it's highly interactive and will produce configurations that continue to live and interact essentially forever. It has many combinatorial properties, and it can be thought of in terms of interacting populations. And so it's really quite an interesting variation on life. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we'll think about what we have done.